Like any small town, the islands of Hawaii have always had a history carefully enclosed within its borders. Open only to interpretation by those without, the picture is altered by outside rumors and speculation. The reality often dismissed due to the careful protected image that breeds tourism. When the layers are peeled back, you find a cold, dark, hidden history in which the neglect of the matter endures to this day. The lost tribe of Ephraim, Puerto Ricans as they are known today, have been coerced, enslaved, and hidden on this island for over 100 years. They are still today on the island, lost in a simulation, social obscurity, appropriation, and shame. The truth of the matter is, Puerto Ricans fell curse to a game of political and economic chess of which they were the pieces. How is it possible that a place known for its beauty, low crime, tourism, and world-class beaches could hold such a nightmarish past? We'll dive into the evidence and the mouths of historians and the scholarly documentation and let the truth find you. The year is 1898. Long-standing tension between the United States and waning Spanish Empire begin to spike and inevitably come to a head when the U.S. warship, the USS Maine, sent to Cuba, is damaged by explosion and sunken. Now having the fuel and the support, the United States declares war on Spain. Spain, facing financial troubles of their own and rebellions in their distant territories, is soundly defeated by U.S. forces in just 6 months. This leads to the 1898 Treaty of Paris, which leaves Puerto Rico under the rulership of the United States. Finally free from the 400-year rule of the Spaniards, Puerto Ricans expect a lesser yoke, but are immediately subjected to the same colonial re-education the so-called North American Indians were subjected to that killed the Indian and saved the man. The oppressive thumb seemed no better than that of the Spaniards. But the continuation of their long and arduous existence happens on the other side of the earth. In the year 1899, Puerto Rico was struck by a duo of hurricanes, one unnamed, the other the infamous San Ciriaco, the longest enduring hurricane in history and one of the most devastating hurricanes in the recorded history of the island. The financial devastation was equivalent to $626 million today. The hurricane left 3,800 fatalities in the Caribbean, with over 3,300 of those being in Puerto Rico alone. The plantation industries were effectively destroyed overnight, an all too familiar position that we've seen in Hurricane Maria in 2017. So now the Puerto Ricans sit in desolation and starvation with no citizenship, no support from the United States, and no international recognition as a nation of people. This provides a perfect opportunity for Hawaii's Big Five.
The circumstances in Puerto Rico that drove the Puerto Ricanos to Hawaii, as given by most historians, were that the invasion by the United States Army had cut off all of Puerto Rico's commerce, especially the coffee. The United States also stopped importing the Puerto Rican sugar. There was a hurricane, San Ciriaco, on August 8th of 1899 that wiped out the southwestern part of the island, killing about 3,000 people, wiping out the subsistence crops that people depended on for their daily bread.
Leviticus chapter 26 and verse 32. And I will bring the land into desolation, and your enemies which dwell therein shall be astonished at it. And I will scatter you among the heathen, and will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. The Big Five, as they are known, are 5 corporations that rose to great power in the late 1800s, eventually controlling about 90% of the sugar industry in Hawaii, and becoming in essence a monopoly in the entirety of the Pacific. Through financial power, they gained great political power, and effectively controlled most of the island's operations. A huge snare for the Big Five were massive labor revolts. Frequently, immigrants such as the Japanese, Chinese, and Koreans, as well as the local Hawaiians, were now recognizing their national power and now demanding better wages and treatment. With their business operations shut down and becoming more costly, the tragedy in Puerto Rico couldn't have come at a better time. The plantation owners began an aggressive campaign to recruit Puerto Ricans that were out of work to come work in Hawaii. Newspapers were flooded with these ads, and headhunters were employed to find those that would make the journey. Despite the Puerto Rican skill and experience, the very reason stated for why they were called upon, a campaign of defamation met them immediately upon their arrival, which would continue on permanently.
The first Puerto Ricans to come to Hawaii started arriving on December 23rd, 1900. The 11th group arrived in October of 1901. That was a total of about, it was about 5,000 men, women, and children.
Concerning the accuracy of numbers and arrivals, the ledgers leave much to be desired. It is documented by plantation authorities that about 5,000 arrived on the island after about 11 expeditions. Upon further investigation, this is almost impossible to be a truth. The expedition was arduous to say the least, and filled with death and sickness. Quite often, Puerto Ricans were transferred by armed guards and fell victim to various sicknesses due to poor nutrition during the trip. A large portion of them could not or would not make the journey and elected to stay in or escape to California. The Puerto Rican population growth in places like San Francisco was relative to the growth in Hawaii. The fields were similar in burden to those of Puerto Rico, but the living conditions and the culture shock were devastating to say the least. They soon found that the contracts they were offered were not honored and would often have to move from plantation to plantation seeking better wages, if wages at all. Other nations began to become fierce adversaries, the Japanese in particular. At the time, the Japanese were on record the largest plantation demographic and saw the Puerto Ricans as a threat to their labor strikes, and they were. The Japanese plantation's population had passed 80,000 long before the arrival of Puerto Ricans, adding credence to the fact that there were more than 5,000 arrivals. Fierce treatment from the overseers and being outnumbered on all sides left them with very little options. After nearly 120 years of being on the islands of Hawaii, the Puerto Rican today is effectively invisible. They have essentially been left to a few restaurants and hidden amongst the locals and other nationalities scattered throughout the islands, normally claiming themselves to be Portuguese due to the social status that the Puerto Rican has been relegated to.
My parents were born and raised in Kauai, and my grandfather came from, he was born in Ponce, Puerto Rico, and he was raised in Aljunta, and my grandmother was from Peñuela.
I used to listen to anything that has music, you know, like from 7 years old. I used to play the guitar. I couldn't read notes, but just the sound of it, you know. So then I started to play. I made my own group, girls group.
They didn't really teach too much about Puerto Rico when I was going to school. Anything you wanted to learn, you had to go to the library, and they had only very limited information about Puerto Rico itself. And in fact, even in high school, when I was going to high school, you know, you had to go find a map someplace and then get an encyclopedia out, and they give you a little short paragraph of Puerto Rico, and that's all you had.
We used to scream Black Power while heroin was pushed. But at the end of the day, nothing's in vain. IUIC has been given a vision. The tents of Judah has risen. Many has attempted the mission, minor murmuring, omitting, and missing the mark. Just reading that he had the flame of fire in his eyes gave us the spark. We on Paul's mission. We out on the road, purple and gold, from Mexico, Cuba, Haiti, Ghana, Sierra Leone. 144,000 boots banging, concrete crackling. These are our men repented at heart. The scriptures is proof. IUIC, we deliver the truth.